Hey everyone, and welcome to the 74th edition of DF Direct Weekly. It is indeed our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. Much to discuss this week, though we're going to be dominated by just one topic. And joining me to discuss it, Alex Battaglia.
Oh, here I am drinking water. Yes, Rich, it's Spider-Man coming out on PC. Biggest news of the week by far. I've been burning the midnight oil, Rich, on this video.
I have as well. It's just been quite an interesting experience, which I'm looking forward to discussing. And of course, John Linneman.
It's amazing seeing a game like Spider-Man cruising along at like 90 to 100 frames per second with all those features. Like, man, it's just... it looks really good on PC, I gotta say. So, and Alex, your coverage is robust. So, yeah, we should probably get into that.
Absolutely. So, first news topic of the week is indeed the fact that Spider-Man Remastered has arrived on PC. Wow, this has been quite an extended and torturous review process for a whole number of reasons. The good news is that the product that's come out at the end of it is very, very good. Not quite perfect, but very, very good. Alex, where do we begin with this one? I mean, we received the code, mid last week?
Yeah, like the end of the week before last is the way I would put it. And then, you receive the code and like the review process for PC games and console games, it can be really awesome at times. Like, for example, I think when John got like The Last of Us Part 2, it was like maybe a month ahead of time, I feel. And it was basically gold. And, it was already like basically a perfect game in a lot of ways. And here it came in, I would say, a less than perfect state. And they already kind of said that with the review documentation, saying like, oh, Ryzen performance isn't good, RT is not complete, DLSS is not complete. And all those things kind of precluded the ability to cover it in a DF fashion because we knew there was patches coming and you wanted to show off the game as it would be when people play it. So it slowed down the review process for sure. There was still a lot of testing done during that time and I still made recordings, but let's just say I threw them all out for the most part there. So that's what made it hard. The game kept getting updated during the review process with sometimes extreme changes towards the settings and or what the settings do and or certain performance things, which, if you want the video in the end to be representative of what people are playing and whatever the developers made to, then you have to kind of do the diligence and redo the work. Maybe it's annoying, but I did it. But
you pulled like an all-nighter on this one, huh, Alex? I mean, it was...
Yeah, I did.
It required some serious work.
Let's just say, like, when I knew the patch was going to be coming ahead of time, we did get heads up through PR about it, but Wednesday, the day of the embargo, like a couple hours before the embargo, patch drops, which... I can talk about basically a little bit what makes Spider-Man on PC interesting and why this patch that just came out before launch was so important to cover. Open world games with, just open world games in general and games that are open world with ray tracing are heavy on the CPU. Doubly so with ray tracing. And that is because in the background, there has to be a structure built on the CPU and GPU. It's both of them. It needs maintenance on the GPU and CPU. And, this structure for the BVH and then all the crowds and traffic and level of detail stuff, well, that's really heavy on the CPU. And originally, before the Wednesday patch, all of the ray tracing and all of the LOD options were in monolithic options in the menu. There was just two. There was a ray tracing toggle with just like presets of like medium, high, very high. And then like LOD controlled crowds, it controlled traffic, and it controlled the way objects render into the distance. It was just like way too much into one option. So if you had a PC, for example, with like a weaker CPU, but a really good GPU, you really couldn't find a good middle ground experience there with the settings that were provided. And this was one of the critiques that I provided back to Nixies. And I think they did change it partially as a result of our feedback given these options. So that's why I really want to make sure that was included in the coverage. And it made the game a lot better as a result. You have a lot more control over how ray tracing looks in terms of like resolution, the quality of the objects in it, and how far these objects are rendered into the distance. And so if you have a mid-range PC, I think you can get a much better experience now than you could in the game way it was before launch. And then there's all these other changes in there with DLSS. But, long story short regarding the Spider-Man PC port is that it is coming out, like Rich said, in a imperfect state, but it's pretty good. The imperfect aspect is a really confusing one, and I probably want your commentary on this, which as well too, Rich, is just, I don't think we've really ever seen it before, where the lower end your GPU is, even if you have like a perfect CPU, you just get like erratic frame times when moving around the city. But this doesn't manifest as much, and then not at all the higher your GPU gets, right?
Yeah, I think we should probably rewind just a little bit because before the Wednesday patch, there was the Monday patch, right? And then before the Monday patch, there was the patch that I think added in hair quality preset support. That might have been, but regardless, there was a patch also that made it work on Steam Deck because the initial one didn't work. But anyway, we kind of reached the point, I think, at the beginning of the week where we thought, right, okay, let's start getting some performance numbers. And we knew this project was going to be big, so I decided to take that on, predominantly because I've got more GPUs than Alex. And I think we really wanted to test out how the older GPUs are holding up, specifically the GTX 1060 and the RX 580, which are still the most popular GPUs from AMD and NVIDIA based on the Steam hardware survey. So those GPUs are also recommended for 1080p 60 gaming by Nixis and Insomniac. So, basically, right, okay, I bought a new 1060 because you might remember from our Marvel's Avengers coverage that I dropped my 1060 and it didn't work anymore. So I got a new 1060 in. Essentially I was running like a 10900K and there were some severe frame time issues and stuttering issues that made 60 FPS essentially impossible, and it could drop down. I mean, I couldn't believe the results, and so Alex, you tested the 1060 with a 12900K and you were still getting into like 40 FPS territory. Which obviously is an issue. So, I logged it with Nixis and I noted the issue was there also on the RX 580, but not quite as bad because the performance level generally on the 580 is higher. And they came back and said that there's a really aggressive occlusion culling system on the Insomniac engine, which is great for performance, but when new detail hoves into view, it can cause a spike in draw calls. And okay, fair enough, but it didn't explain the behavior with these lower end GPUs because typically when you get a spike in draw calls, you expect that to be a CPU limitation, right? But 12900K with a 1060 was pretty disastrous. So yeah, I think the occlusion thing is an issue and remains an issue. The frame times that were identified as a GPU problem appear to have, well, they have been smoothed out significantly, but we're still not really in perfect territory there. It still needs some improvement. So we couldn't really run performance tests based on the Monday patch because we knew, it was logged. We knew that Nixis were working on it, and indeed on the embargo day, the new patch came out that did improve performance, but it's still not quite where it should be. So this has been a really difficult situation for a number of reasons because this game came in hot. Ideally, the developer would have had an extra couple of weeks based on what we saw and the issues that were cleared up in the last few days, but it's still not quite there. And so I do think the game required a little bit of extra time, but the core fundamentals were there from, if you've got a really powerful PC, I mean, I played on 5950X with a RTX 3090. It was a pretty awesome experience right from the moment the game dropped, right? And I think even if you had like a 2060 Super or 2070 or 3060, that class of card and a decent CPU, you'd have had, it's been happy days from day one. But, the more permutations we tested, the more issues we found. And also, I think you noted, Alex, that there were some bugs in the ray tracing that needed addressing. Like screen space information was missing.
Yeah, so like if you did use footage, for example, from the not most recent patch as of Monday, in coverage of this, you would see a lot of issues with the ray tracing. One, it was like completely different. Like the menu options, just like it, at one point, like the medium ray tracing was like 1/8 res without any denoising. It was just like the options were in complete flux. So yeah, like ray tracing before Monday didn't even have screen space information in it. A lot of objects were missing or had the wrong colored texture and things like that. And a number of things that I would say like 95% of them are now gone with the most recent patch that came out on Wednesday and Monday. So as I see it right now, I think this is a really great port in general. I love the options menu, for example. But one thing that is a little bit of a downer in it is that issue that Rich was just talking about with the lower end GPU frame time issue. And then also a bit of the CPU performance in general, where it does make sense that a game that would be coming to PC would require a higher end CPU due to the fact that the API layer is a bit heavier. And, you know, there's some other aspects in there too. But it does seem at times a little bit heavier than I imagined it would be, namely based upon other open world games that have ray tracing in them. Like I'm thinking about Watch Dogs Legion a little bit, or kind of Cyberpunk, where it does work in those games to a certain degree, but I don't know if it's as heavy as it is here. And this game also has a lot less ray tracing than something like Cyberpunk. So I think still in the back end, like Rich is saying, there may be a couple more weeks. I do think they're probably going to address this GPU times issue and also the heaviness of how this is on the CPU over time, because, you know, in our we had an interview with them, which is really cool. And I hope it comes out on the website soon enough on Eurogamer. But we talked about like CPU stuff. We talked about how they do ray tracing. They talked a lot and really honestly about the PC porting effort. So definitely check that out when it comes out.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. But essentially, I think part of the problem for coverage in general was essentially that if everybody went live with videos on embargo day, they were going to be running a version of the game or showing a version of the game that specifically with ray tracing isn't representative of the final product. And, you know, obviously there are a big bunch of comparison videos that came out. This is the high-end PC experience. It's not. We, you know, so we basically decided for whatever reasons to hold fire until we could actually show you the game as you would play it on day one. And I think,
yes,
I think we've done that. I guess my only concern is I'm about to embark on more performance testing, you know, based on day one code, but that could change, you know, within days if they isolate this issue.
Well, true. I mean, now that it's out there for the public to purchase, I think it's fair game.
Absolutely,
it's like fair game now. Yeah, at that point, yeah.
So, Alex, I'm curious about your interview with Nixis. I mean, this happened on the Monday where the new patch dropped. And I'm curious about some of the things you were talking about in terms of how they adapted what is, you know, a PlayStation exclusive to the metal for PC, which is running on a completely different API.
Yeah, so that is the interesting part of this, where some developers maintain a really great PC version along the side, and here, you know, it wasn't as bad as I would say God of War, where with like God of War they had like just like it could render like a box maybe, and that was about, if you remember, if you recall that
interview. They were really happy with the box, but they
were really happy with the box
for sort of stage one to get something rendering.
So here there's like an in between ground. They did have like actually I believe it was if I recall DX11 editor tools, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
So they could edit the game on PC and see visual rendering and all that stuff, which is the whole point of it. But there was no DX12 that was really there at all for a game, and obviously no DXR as a result of that too. So the ray tracing wouldn't have been in. And the beginning of the project was essentially months, which is really, I can't even imagine how frustrating it must be, months of just the game rendering on PC only as a black screen under DX12. So that's how it started off. And then there was an extreme effort, I would say, to bring over a lot of the streaming code, making sure it's properly multi-threaded, changing the ray tracing. So on console, it uses something like that's the equivalent of like DXR 1.1 inline tracing, which is more beneficial towards AMD GPUs because from where it casts like that ray query, if that's what it's called under Vulkan. I always forget what it's called under DXR, but they actually changed that to use like a more DXR 1.0 style, which is better on like NVIDIA and Intel chips typically. And as well, they had to make sure that like shader compilation was working correctly, which we also talked very frankly about the state of shader compilation on PC in general. And they all had very awesome opinions about that, very specific opinions as well too, which is great to hear from developers, from people who literally have to deal with this issue every day. And I think the generic gist there, they're not very happy with the situation, just to spoil it.
But they are dealing with it, which is the good news.
They are dealing with it. Yeah, Nixie's ports ever since Deus Ex Mankind Divided, I think that's after that game, that's when they really had like a good DX12 understanding. Like, I think Shadow of the Tomb Raider was one of the first DX12 games we ever saw that had like remarkably better performance under DX12.
Oh yeah.
If I recall. So, they had a good understanding of these things. I sat down in the room with 4 people, of people with a variety of different disciplines, and just hearing the stories of behind the scenes about how much actual work had to make this game a PC game. Like, a PC game isn't just supporting 16:9 at 30 and or 60 FPS. It's like variable frame rate, multiple aspect ratios, has to work on a hard drive and an SSD. It has to do all these things that a console game wouldn't have to do, and they were never thought of in the first time. So a lot of the stuff going into this PC version, from what I could understand in this interview, is actually just like a ton of work that Nixis had to do manual work.
Did you guys test this on the mechanical hard drive?
I have not tested it on mechanical hard drive.
I'm curious about that.
But the thing is, they said they literally do try and make sure it works on even things below the minimum spec. They did say that in the conversation. So the minimum spec says something, but technically, if you really wanted to, you could probably run this on something like a Q6600. I don't know.
I guess the idea there is that the minimum spec provides them like the support minimum, where it's like if you're under this, it's like use at your own risk.
Yeah, it's most definitely something they cannot guarantee looks fine at all.
Exactly.
And part of this, was getting the game running on Steam Deck as well, which has its own platform constraints, and was also part of the push for them to have different settings. So, you would imagine like a low and a very low and a medium and a high in a game, but they also purposely put in things that are like very low.
Potato.
For potential, potato level for the Steam Deck. But you don't have to run the Steam Deck at that, but those are things that they wanted to put in for people that are running the Steam Deck if they want to have more choice than just low. So they really did put a lot of care and effort to this, and it really just kind of, radiated throughout this entire 1 hour long conversation I had with them.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the recommended specs, or rather the minimum specs. It's GTX 950 with an i3 4160. It's a dual core CPU. That's for 720p 30. Which is quite interesting because you can do 720p 30 on Steam Deck with high settings if you use dynamic resolution scaling, medium if you don't. So, there is a great deal of scalability in there. I've been looking at it on Steam Deck, and essentially I discovered in the city swinging, not the swimming. Swimming would be good, wouldn't it? In the swinging through the city, which is kind of like a big stress test for CPU and GPU. There's a good, 80% of extra performance unlocked by moving from very high to very low. So that scalability has paid off, which I think is great. And I think just generally, it's really nice to see the game running rather well on Steam Deck. There are streaming CPU-based limitations, as you would expect from, a quad-core CPU cluster that's basically got very, very little power to work with. So you've really got to use a 30 FPS cap. People can't seem to accept that you can't run this at 40. You can't, not consistently. But that's the way it is. But yeah, I mean, there is scalability there. It does look great. I'm really happy with the way the ports come out. I was a bit alarmed that the number one GPU according to the Steam hardware survey wasn't providing a good experience, and you still can't get 60 FPS with that, even with a super high-end CPU. So there is work to do there.
Yeah, this is a bit of a kind of litmus test, if that's the proper phraseology, with console ports tends to be, can you get 60 FPS on a 1060 at settings close to a PS4 and basically doubling the frame rate of a PS4? Because that's what you would expect a lot of the time. And if not, then the RX 580. And this here out of the box, kind of like Horizon Zero Dawn, also isn't doing that, but for different reasons. Here it's really that erratic frame time issue. So I think once they clear that up, though, we'll start seeing GPU performance on that lower end that scales more like we're used to seeing, especially with dynamic resolution scaling enabled, because the consoles are using that as well too. One thing I just want to touch on before we go is, like, as a part of these ray tracing settings that they added in, they really did make sure that they increased the quality of ray tracing on PC, because the game was designed around PlayStation 5 constraints. And it's a good looking ray tracing on a console game, but like as soon as you blow that up to like native 4K 60 and you're like walking around, you're like, oh, you can see the compromises. And I've got all this GPU power. What do we do with it? Well, Nixies were thankfully, and as Insomniac helped out here too, apparently, they really wanted to make sure that if you have a bigger GPU, the game does scale in some ways quite dramatically higher than what you can find on console. So I'm really grateful for that because sometimes you see like a port to PC and it's just like the console settings with like some slightly better shadows. But here there are actually significant differences in there.
Yeah, I think this was something else we pointed out, right? There was an issue with crowd density with on the very high setting where it actually looks better on PS5, but that's not the case on the final code. But just generally, it's just the concept that you're getting a really good ray tracing experience day one. But, people are still going to be playing this game 10 years from now, where the ray tracing performance on the GPU is going to be off the charts based by today's standards. So why not build in that level of scalability? Why not make everything the best it can be within the constraints of that engine? And they pushed for that. It arrived kind of a bit late, but it's there and it looks awesome. And just generally, it's just really nice to see another really good port from Sony. The other thing, which I think is worth highlighting, which you're going to be looking at next, I believe, is really solid support for upscaling. FSR 2.0, the Insomniac solution, which we've been amazed by for a long time now, is in there on PC. Ready for your for your zooming antics, Alex. I can't wait to see that, and DLSS and support for all of those with dynamic resolution scaling.
Yeah, Nixies semi-pioneered doing this in their work on, I forget the name of this, Marvel's Avengers, right? So that game had DLSS plus plus DRS on PC, which was really cool. We didn't end up covering that, unfortunately. But here, this time around, seeing all these arrayed right next to each other, FSR 2.0 DLSS and the Insomniac Games solution, I haven't done nearly enough testing to say like anything really final about it, but there's some very interesting different behavior here between them all in terms of like the resolve. And sometimes, just like, once again, just like DLSS surprises me at the stuff it can do. Like, that's one of the things I noticed, like in the review process, it was a bit of a shame because DLSS wasn't working initially with the first couple patches. Like, it was pretty broken when you would turn it on. So, I mean, I'm going to be covering that. You're going to like the video. It's not going to maybe go as far as something as God of War because we've already done these type of comparisons before. It's more about getting like a general idea about it. But yeah, because like, there's only so many times you can hammer a point home, to say the least.
You say that though, but I do think the Insomniac versus FSR 2.0 comparison is going to be intriguing, because the Insomniac solution was designed for PlayStation 4, PlayStation 4 Pro, right? It's going to be a very low weight. I use the word cheap not as in bad, but as in computationally light solution that produced phenomenal results, whereas its direct counterpart in the PC space is right there, FSR 2.0, but this is considerably heavier, I would suspect, in terms of its computational requirement. So to actually see, it may well be the case with dynamic resolution scaling that you're going to have a lower resolution with FSR 2.0 just to accommodate the milliseconds of computational time extra that FSR 2.0 requires. Really interesting.
That is interesting. Like, there's this overhead for DLSS and FSR 2.0, which can tip the balance a little bit in the way you're describing there. And as a part of this video, I'm going to do like the very raw, what I consider the ultimate comparison of like performance mode versus all one another, which is like the hardest thing to do in upscaling. 4 times upscale. But one thing I also want to do also is a couple tests of where their performance equals, where you have a GPU that is not capable of hitting a sustained, let's say 4K 60 normally, but it can do that with DLSS, the Insomniac games, and FSR 2.0, but they're just left to free float in terms of dynamic resolution scaling. So we can see essentially what is the best that each solution can do there in terms of like internal res and the output res. And I think that's going to produce very interesting results. Yeah.
Again, I think that's going to be really interesting to see the Insomniac solution, because it wasn't designed to do 4x resolution scaling. It was kind of like from 1440p to 4K. So there may well be interesting cost versus quality comparisons there.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So lots still to come on Spider-Man PC. It's a hot topic for sure. But let's move on to our next topic. Not so much a news topic, just a really interesting mod that turned up, which John pointed out to me earlier in the week. Boneworks is one of the most impressive virtual reality games out there. And there's a mod that essentially transforms it into a kind of Metal Gear Solid PS1 hybrid. Looks quite compelling, right, John?
Yeah, so essentially they have created this mod to mimic the original look and design of Metal Gear Solid 1 on PlayStation. So, unfiltered textures and that sort of thing. But it's certainly a step up from that in terms of like some of the asset quality, like for the weapons. But yeah, it's essentially building upon the framework of Boneworks to recreate aspects of Metal Gear Solid completely in VR. And I haven't actually tried it yet, and that's something I want to load up when I finish my current very large project. But the thing I love, it reminds me what I love about Boneworks in general is the way they convey like the movement of everything, because it has that full body experience. So like your weapons and everything are physicalized objects. They're attached on your torso, and you actually need to grip them with the controller to keep them in your hand, right? If you let off the grip, you just drop it on the floor. If you pull out your pistol, put a silencer on it, you actually need to, physically manipulate the weapon to use it, right? It's not just glued to your hand. You're not just pulling a trigger. You actually need to manipulate it, which is cool, I think. And, just seeing old school pixelated unfiltered textures and low poly objects done in VR, it's an enjoyable thing, because your eyes don't try to perceive it as something real. So in a way, it ends up feeling almost more immersive. It's a weird thing, but yeah, I would like to try it and see how far along it actually is. I mean, it does not seem to recreate the cinematics of the game, obviously. It's just pure gameplay based, but it looks good.
It does look good. I'm watching the footage now, and I'm kind of reminded that whenever a good remaster comes out, it tends to highlight the quality of the original artwork and the artistic direction that, and that holds up, despite higher resolutions and whatnot. And I'm looking at this, and it looks good, despite the fact that it is, clearly drawing upon the PlayStation 1 aesthetic. Just goes to show that, class is permanent.
That's actually something really interesting because this week for my other project that I've been working on, I've been playing around more with DuckStation on the PC, which people have raved about for a long time. And it's really interesting looking at some of the games through that emulator with the enhancements that it offers, such as, it corrects the texture warping issue. You can super sample or downsample, I guess, from very high resolutions and retain the original pixel grid styling of the PS1. But it really shows how strong a lot of the art direction and model quality actually was during that era, and that it was kind of just spoiled by limitations of the hardware. When you remove the issues, it's like, wow, this is a beautiful game. And it really gives you like a newfound respect for it. Like something like Rage Racer, especially. I was playing that and just like completely shocked by how good it actually looks through DuckStation. And that's the kind of feeling you get when you see this Metal Gear Solid stuff done in VR, where it's very boxy, low-res textures, pixelated, but it has like a real sense of style to it that holds up very well.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what, John, I would really like to see a Metal Gear Solid DF Retro, which would also encompass, of course, the Twin Snakes remake.
Oh yeah, that
Oh
is
my
something
God.
I want to tackle. That's a good idea. I would
Mhm.
like to do
That's
that.
that's a big one because like I feel like John could do that really well because the lead up to Metal Gear Solid is Metal Gear, and you have these like characters in this universe in a 2D plane, and all of a sudden it's brought into 3D, and like Rich was saying, like the art style and the art in Metal Gear Solid, the first game, is just like impeccable. It's incredible looking. It's timeless. It just looks so good in spite of all the limitations of the hardware. And that's the one thing that actually interested me about this is that it's not going to be using MGS1 mechanics, but I think the very general idea of taking the Metal Gear Solid like rules of engagement and applying them into a more VR immersive simish style kind of environment is just like perfect, because Metal Gear Solid 5 tried to do that to a degree given the limitations of the hardware and all the things for that time, and the limitations of third person perspective, of course. But this is kind of what I'm imagining that is like, just in the VR stage, where you can like experiment with the environment, experiment with the guards, do really funny sneaking tactics, because I imagine that we'll have all of that. Yeah.
That's kind of what separates Metal Gear from a lot of other games, in that it's very systems driven, and you have all these tools handed to you, and then the AI is specifically designed to be fun to play with, right? Like it's not meant to be the most challenging AI. It's the kind of AI where just toying with them and testing your limits is fun in and of itself. And I think that is kind of something I want to see more of. And yeah, it's perfect for the VR space because you have that additional awareness around you. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's still the spectre, of course, of PSVR 2 just around the corner. But I'm really hoping that we see a kind of reboot of VR and VR development. And but I do think there's a place for taking older games and reworking them in VR. I mean, just looks
I
really,
agree.
really compelling.
The thing about VR right now that's kind of a shame is, since Half-Life Alyx, Meta has had a lot of success with the Quest, which has turned out to be a bad thing, because being less capable for one thing, and it's tough to make money on large budget VR games. The platform's been flooded with basically VR shovelware, right? And just the quality of the experiences that are out there has been kind of reduced, and it feels like it's just not being taken seriously anymore, and it's almost turned into, I don't get mad at me for saying this, but it feels more like the mobile game space. Not that there's not good stuff in the mobile space, there is, but yeah, VR is not doing great right now, and I feel like PSVR is the one hope we have of sort of pushing higher end experiences again, because PS5 being more capable hardware, it would suggest that PC versions of those games and PC like experiences would also need to target PCs again instead of the Quest. So even though the freedom of the Quest is great, it hasn't been great for development.
Right. I think that the development has just skewed in a very different direction. There have been some really great Quest games, but you're right. If you look at Half-Life Alyx as a kind of watermark, a benchmark, so to speak, of that sort of set the agenda for the new phase of VR games. That phase never happened. You've got Alyx, and that's it, really. And yeah, fingers crossed that PSVR 2 will kind of rekindle that. And of course, as we'll say it again, we'll port beg once again, Alex, on PSVR 2, please.
That would, I mean, I've played it, but I think there's a lot of people that have not, and
Absolutely.
it would be amazing to put out there. It's so good. You guys have played it, right? I mean,
yeah, it's a freaking incredible game. I also think one of my favorite things about, I hope we're not diverging so much from the topic, but just like they maintained like the art style that Half-Life 2 established, but like hyper detailed. And I find that impressive. That was not easy to do, but they managed it flawlessly.
Their lighting solution, very baked, very static, but so beautiful. Just a great looking game.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to our final news topic. Very, very quick. Just following up on some of the stuff we've been discussing in the past. Obviously, we're on the cusp of a new wave of graphics hardware coming. There have been some quite alarming power consumption, or TDPs, mooted, 450 watts upwards. And it looks like there were going to be some increases in power consumption for lower end cards as well. New rumor, but it is from a good source. It's Copite7 Kimmy, who is usually pretty bang on with the stuff that he reports, is saying that the RTX 4080 drops down to 320 watts, 4070, 285 watts, 320 watts. That is high, but it's the same as the 3080. Off the top of my head, I guess I could Google it, but I do not know what the 37 TDP is. But yeah, fundamentally, the key issue here is that, well, the cost of electricity, I'm looking at maybe a 3 times increase when I renew my fixed rate, possibly higher than that even.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so the concept of your GPU drawing so much more power, over, cost of play over a year is going to be significantly higher. I just did that Google, by the way. The 3070 was 290 watts, so the 4070 is slightly lower, according to this
Not
rumor.
bad.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a move in the right direction. I guess my question for you, Alex, is can we do more? Because the thing here is that, essentially you're looking at your GPU. The TDP is typically your GPU running flat out at all times. I think Radeon has Radeon Chill, which essentially lowers power consumption. I think it's essentially bringing you to the sweet spot in terms of
what the chip's capable of,
and versus power consumption. But there are things that gamers can do, right? Number one, set a frame rate limit. Any other stuff?
Always. Well, yes.
Lower settings.
Set a frame rate limit, use DLSS and or TAAU and or FSR 2.0 to reduce the cost of rendering more pixels. Also, take a look into, so like Radeon Chill's good, but I don't know how it compares to undervolting, for example, which is something that is very common on especially Ampere cards these days, where the default voltage is essentially to make the card competitive for marketing and performance purposes. You'll definitely get the better performance there, but it also is probably it is beyond the tipping point of what it could be for the most efficient hardware usage in terms of how much power is put into the card for the frame rate given back to it. The thing about FPS caps, though, I think is really important, because I read more than enough forum posts and enough Steam posts to realize that I think a lot of people just play completely uncapped on like FreeSync, G-Sync screens, which I personally think would probably look rather terrible because like you look at the sky, it's like 140 FPS, and you look back at the like the horizon line and you're at 70. Like that's like a real thing that actually happens if you're using any settings above medium in a game. So I don't think that looks good anyways. And honestly, I think if you are playing on a high refresh rate monitor and you want the VRR experience for a single player game, I'm not talking about competitive multiplayer CSGO, 300 FPS, we play on potato settings. I don't cover that kind of stuff. But I'm talking about like a single player or a game that you actually want to enjoy the experience and have it look good. I kind of want to say the max FPS you should set should be around 100 almost. Like the dividends above 100, I can see them for sure. But for a single player game, I kind of feel like that's where you'd want to go. What do you guys think?
I think the concept of how you deploy power needs to be changed. We need to change our perception of it because, well, let's turn this around and look at CPUs, right? I mean, there's a lot of heat, literally, leveled at 12900K because if you run an HEVC encode for half an hour, you're drawing like 250 watts or whatever.
Yeah, Rich, this job has raised our energy bills.
Yeah. but the point is that when you're gaming, your defining limit on performance is usually the GPU. So your CPU is going underutilized for the most part, but you buy your higher end CPU not for its flat out performance, but you want the performance when it's required, right? When that scene is really complicated, you're going to get massive stutters on your, older, 6700K or something, and you'll get a vastly smoother and improved experience from your, 5950 or 12900K, right? So you're basically paying for much better performance when the action is at its hottest and really when you want the smoothest performance. So you've kind of got to apply that mentality, I think, to GPUs as well, where you set a level where you'd like your sweet spot, your most consistent performance. And I agree with you, Alex. It's kind of around 90 to 100 FPS in my view. 120 on a non-VRR screen is pretty awesome, but if you've got VRR, you can hover between 100 to 120 and it still looks pretty awesome. So I think it's just a case of how that power is deployed, which will result in lower power bills. Maybe we should just do a video on this to actually illustrate the point, and also to put into perspective that your 240 watt flat out CPU isn't going to be running at 240 watts when you're playing Marvel Spider-Man or whatever. So yeah, it's a case of putting it into perspective, I think. But yeah, really interesting stuff. And it is good that, potentially the 4070 and 4080 will be a bit more restrained.
If you really want efficiency, if you want to play at 75 frames per second for dozens of hours on a single AA battery, the WonderSwan, that's what it does. 75 frames per second, over 20 hours, spot. One AA battery. Right here. That's what else you need. One AA battery. Like how efficient is that?
It has a 75 hertz display.
It does.
Which is bizarre. I had a conversation with John about this. I'd never even heard of that ever.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's super smooth.
Wow. Very, very nice. But that's the end of our news topics for this week. Going to be talking, well, it's usually our content discussion section, but we're just going to be talking about a couple of other random things that we need to discuss. DigitalFoundry.net, it is the site for our Patreon supporters, right? It's where you can go to access all of those high quality video downloads, but it hasn't historically been very well integrated with Patreon. So, if you go to Patreon, you get a big bunch of bonus materials and tons of other great stuff, early access, all of this stuff, which we could never show on digitalfoundry.net. So digitalfoundry.net is getting an upgrade. It should be live hopefully next week. And what it's going to do is essentially plumb in directly with Patreon. And, if you're a premium supporter, you'll be able to see all of that premium supporter exclusive content. You'll have the early access flagged right in front of you without having to go to Patreon to see the post. And also, I think what's quite exciting about this is that we've been doing the enhanced DF supporter program for 18 months now, close to that. So there's actually a big bank of exclusive content that's built up over that period that we've never released publicly. And, again, you don't really have to sort of laboriously go back through old Patreon posts to find it now. It's all going to be signposted rather on digitalfoundry.net. So yeah, really excited about this. Tons of retro stuff.
I was going to say next week, mid to late week, the new DF Retro should be out as well on Klonoa. So 46 minutes done right now. You can check it out via that new webpage, hopefully.
So it's going to be, really good stuff, and just will give you extra value from supporting us, simply because if you're a new supporter, you'll be able to easily tap into all of the stuff that we've done in the past, and all the new stuff we are doing. It's just going to be more readily accessible. So it's good stuff. The next point I just want to talk about is a friend of Digital Foundry, Amy Elgar, is going to be streaming Half-Life 1 and 2 for 24 hours straight. I wouldn't want to do that.
Incredible.
But it is in favour of a great cause, Breast Cancer UK. There will be a URL at the bottom there, so please do donate. I have done so. And yes, that's good stuff. So look out for that.
I'm just curious, like, is it Half-Life 1 and all the expansions, and then Half-Life 2 and all the expansions? Oh my God, that would be...
And split screen on PlayStation 2?
And and uplink and all that.
Uplink, the demo, They got Blue Shift in there. You got.
I may have to tune in for a bit if I find the time and say hello, because that is incredible. I love first Half-Life. It's a great game.
I hope you haven't just made Amy's task a lot, a 48-hour stream.
You need to cover every Half-Life game. Amy.
Well, if she plays the Xbox version, it's gonna get it's gonna get crazy over there.
Extend the time of that playthrough. Oh my God.
Okay, let's move on to the final part of our show. It's our Digital Foundry supporter Q&A. This is where essentially every week we put out a call to questions to supporters via Patreon to, essentially produce posers for us, and we shall choose the best of them and talk about them on the show. And the first one comes from Adam, and he has the impudence to actually have two questions. So let's get straight into it. Hi, crew. Hope you're going well. This week I had two questions on my mind. Firstly, I've noticed that when announcing the episode number, Richard often seems highly amused, as though he's about to have a sensible chuckle. Is he shocked that the show has run this long? Okay, well, let's just tackle that question. It is quite amusing to me because, when we started Digital Foundry, we had no intention of doing a show like this. We had no intention of producing any kind of personality-led hashtag content. It was kind of like a black box where you'd have inputs and outputs. The input would be the game and the output would be the analysis. So the concept of actually arriving in front of a camera and talking, off the cuff for an hour and a half at times, sometimes even longer, is just kind of mind-boggling, and I'm just surprised that this has proved as popular as it has been. I don't know what you make of that, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, every single time I see the number, I just think, like, oh my gosh, people have listened to me how many times just blather? I do inform myself to make sure I say something well here, but I realize, I'm just a guy. We're just normal men, innocent men, as they say. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get on with Adam's second question to business. Secondly, with the continuation of the Xbox backwards compatibility program, have you been given any indication whether this was predominantly for licensing reasons and/or cost benefit, showing it wasn't worth continuing? Or were there some titles that faced technical obstacles? If so, do you believe that dropping Xbox One compatibility and focusing on Series S/X only would open the door to more titles becoming back compat because of the far more powerful CPUs? What do you reckon about this one, John?
This is tricky. I think in the past they've said that they've done as much as they could with regards to the older stuff on 360 and Xbox, and I think it's less technical and more licensing driven at this point.
Yeah.
And as they noted here, but this is a tricky one.
I think it is licensing, really, isn't it?
But if it were, I guess, a big enough selling point, I'm fairly certain Microsoft could overcome those licensing issues. You know what I mean?
I think they have actually
a number of titles.
Yeah, I think they have actually, where sometimes removed some of the offending licensed material to get those games out there.
That's something that they can do, is actually dig into these games and remove certain files. And I know of games that they've attempted to do this on that didn't work, and they were not able to re-release them as well. So that's unfortunately not always feasible. But yeah, I really wish they would revisit this, because it's less about 360. I think is very well covered, but I think the original Xbox is not. There is a ton of Xbox games, and it's an amazing system, by the way. There's a ton of great stuff on the original Xbox that is not covered at all by this program, and I think I can't believe that they've reached the limits of licensing on original Xbox stuff specifically, given how many other games exist for it,
Yeah,
right?
especially now with
So
Blizzard Activision going down, like
yeah.
that. There's a lot of Blizzard Activision titles on Xbox that could definitely make their way over. That would be really nice to see, actually. So I hope. I don't know. It's really hard to say if that'll mean action as soon as that's done. But the evidence on PC that they're at least dipping back into the catalog with these
Oh, right.
half-hearted, Microsoft Store releases or Insider Program releases. Well, maybe they'll do something similar on Xbox.
Whatever happened, Rich, to the resolution boost thing? I think we come back to this every so often.
We do.
But, you and I, we saw Gears of War Ultimate Edition, an Xbox One game that's limited to 1080p, running at native 4K on Series X, right? And it looked very good.
Yeah.
And then it just sort of quietly never happened.
Yeah, I think they went with a different direction. They went with FPS boost, and
Which is great.
yeah, which is
but
great. And I did actually ask them whether, we've seen this technology working. Why can't you do both together? For an Xbox 360 title, you should be able to do both together, right? Enhanced resolution, and we have actually seen that. In
Well,
one or
they
two
they do
cases.
that actually already, I'd say.
In one or two cases,
Uh,
yeah. But on the Xbox Series side, they just decided to go with the resolution boost, and they told me that it's very difficult to get the two of them running side by side together. But yeah, I think
mm,
well, here we go. Going back to my original visit to Microsoft in 2017 to see Project Scorpio, which became Xbox One X, I did actually speak to Phil Spencer about the kind of the philosophy behind backwards compatibility. And genuinely, he just believes that your games should be able to move with you from one generation to the next. And I don't think it's going to be, as Adam suggests here, a cost benefit calculation. I think it's simply that they're not able to do it for whatever reason. So yeah, I think it's, hopefully they can improve things. There has been sort of, occasional smatterings of new titles coming out, but we're kind of reaching the point where I think they've probably exhausted the possibilities there. But maybe think, I mean, they were talking about licensing agreements on paper in somebody's drawer, and they just don't know whether they can actually do it. And I guess what could happen is that somebody comes out of the woodwork demanding rights payments. So it's not as if they can't, it's not as if they can just put the games out there. Maybe the route forward is simply, emulation. In that case, there's not much that can be done about that. Let's move on to the next question from Concrete Llama. With the recent news about Microsoft magically freeing up more memory for developers to access on the Series S, I was wondering how far they can take it. Hypothetically, how would you feel about the console receiving the option of a compromised mode with a catchier name that significantly reduces the OS features of the console while games are running as a trade-off for improved performance and or additional in-game features such as ray tracing? Would this even be possible? I remember Microsoft did something similar on the Xbox One when they universally disabled the multitasking features. Well,
sounds like
yes.
Switch.
Yeah.
I've got some news for you, Concrete Llama, and it goes, it's kind of stuff I discovered in the wake of the announcement last week. The principal question is that, Microsoft announced hundreds of extra megabytes available to Xbox Series S developers, and I raised the question, well, why not just tell us how many hundreds? And the answer is pretty much exactly because of what you're suggesting here. There's a base, again, I don't have the figures now, which is slightly frustrating, but there's a base level of extra memory that's been given to Series S, just platform level optimizations. However, if a title doesn't use certain system level features, these can be disabled and the memory freed up and given back to the title. So the amount of hundreds of megabytes that is gifted to the Series S changes according to the development needs of the title. So yeah, I thought I would...
we've actually seen this before. If you guys remember, the PlayStation Vita takes this approach. If you boot up a number of titles, it'll actually inform you in the upper corner that like such and such online features are not available for this game or have been disabled. So they could actually shut off certain functionalities of the hardware when starting a game that demanded, a little bit more from it. And that was a way to sort of free up resources if they weren't going to use those functionalities. And it sounds kind of similar here, where it's like developers can seemingly say, well, we don't need these features, so, we'll just use the resources that they would have occupied otherwise.
Yeah. And there was
I wonder.
There was the whole Connect thing as well, where that had its own GPU overhead on the system, which was removed.
It's just a shame they never enabled the GPU and the power brick, though.
Yeah, I know. What a missed opportunity.
And the dual layer ES RAM, of course.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next question. Kieran Welsh asks, how much do you think that ray tracing will improve with gains in software efficiencies alone this generation? Will RT be unrecognizable on Series X and PlayStation 5, for instance? Good question, right, Alex? Because we've already, I think, seen some interesting gains in software efficiencies. When you look at what Marvel Spider-Man was doing, that's really impressive for the level of compute they've got for that.
Yeah, I think it's about leveraging compromises in areas that do not impede the game's visual splendor. Like if you load up the Matrix Awakens demo, which you can't download anymore.
You can download it if you bought it.
Still. You can, yeah, that's right. You can't buy it anymore, or you can't, whatever. You can't find it on the stores anymore. You can still download it. Yes, but if you have that, load it up. If you look, the compromises are there. But the whole point is that it's designing these systems so that the compromises don't become completely obvious. Now, one thing that I do think will programmatically get better over time is in the background, there's a lot of research going on into how to get the best, essentially, visual result from sending the least amount of rays out. And there's a lot of actually NVIDIA-led research here regarding this, like the quote-unquote invention of RESTER, or reservoir spatial temporal sampling, or kind of like going over time, using those samples in a much more intelligent way. I think we're going to see a bit of that on all platforms. And I think that's going to have incredible trickle down to the consoles themselves. Where, like Metro's initial implementation is incredible for the fact that it's 60 FPS, but leveraging technique ideas that came around 2 to 3 years later, maybe it could even be more incredible and or more performant, or allow for new visual trickery in there as well too. So that's where I think it's going to happen. I don't think there is nearly enough at some point in the day, you have to actually trace the race. There's only so much you can do there to make that cheaper. I think there's a hard limit there that's really apparent. But I think that just the way we use these rays is really important. So I think that's going to change a lot.
I mean, Metro is an interesting point, right? Because it launched with RT, and then they launched the enhanced edition, which had the infinite bounce accumulation.
Yep.
And it's game changing. So yeah, and we are just at the beginning of
technique
this.
difference. Yeah. Yeah. So it's in the initial implementation there, it's okay, so you have the ability to run it as half res checkerboarded and or full res, and it does only one native bounce instead of storing other bounces in a world probe grid that then are traced back to. So they changed. What they did is they used less rays overall probably, but used them in a way that was more not efficient, but use them in a way that would make it more obvious visually. That's what I think what it's about. It's using the budget in a better way, not actually making the budget bigger. I think that's really hard to do. The other thing, the micro optimization thing. Yeah.
Okay, next question from Sloth. What are some of your favorite workarounds in retro games to create graphical effects such as reflections, shadows, etc., that we now take for granted? John.
Ooh, yeah, there's so many that I love. For instance, I love the introduction of light maps in Quake, which was like, how can we do this complicated lighting in a 3D scene? And well, they found a nice workaround by essentially baking into textures. And this kind of stuff is pretty, it's a well-known thing now, but at the time it was kind of revolutionary. Or the way reflections were often done, where they essentially draw alternative geometry below the surface. Like Metal Gear Solid 2, for instance, does a great job with this, where they essentially redraw the scene beneath, but it's simplified, and they use textures that have like sort of like alpha blended edges to like simulate like the look of a puddle or like a tile floor. So you're seeing through to another part of the level, but it's designed so it actually looks like a reflection. And the way the artists then actually like create the textures and models under there, it's like they're thinking about it of like, well, this is what a reflection would distort this surface to make it look one way. So we're actually going to draw the texture to look that way, as if it was distorted underneath the floor. It's just really cool artistry there. And of course, there was stuff like rendering out textures, which was super common during that era, where essentially you apply, you're essentially using a secondary camera to capture the scene and then sending that to a texture, and then you apply that texture to a surface, and you can use that to do some pretty slick mirror effects and such like that. If you go back even more old school, I love just the introduction of like per scanline scrolling. So like on the Mega Drive, it only has like 2 layers for like parallax effects essentially that are independent, but they could make parallax look a lot more in depth by using per scanline updates essentially to scroll it at different rates. And then you could also combine that with like extra sprites on top of that to have overlapping parallax. And then you get stuff like Ranger X, where they actually create the illusion of 3D by using a combination of just flat colors and line scrolling together, which is really cool. There's all on Metal Gear Solid again. Another thing I love about MGS2 that you see when you start to break it apart is how, so the cutscenes look amazing in that game, right? And if you looked at a lot of comparable games from that era, especially even on PC, like the cutscene quality was never even close. And part of the reason is that each sequence had its own bespoke room, and the rooms itself would be like completely like unfinished, right? They would only model out exactly what the camera's going to show, and then everything around it is just blank space. And they could actually hop around to different little tiny dioramas that were specifically crafted for each angle. So you get the impression that the camera's moving around all these different scenes, but it's just a bunch of these little tiny dioramas instead of just moving the camera within an already built environment. And it looks amazing as a result, but it's not, it's not a coherent world that they've built for the cutscenes. But it was a way to get a lot of extra fidelity out of something at a time when you couldn't really just build the whole world and throw your camera around without it looking kind of janky. So, stuff like that always comes to mind. I don't know about you guys. What do you think?
I think about the original Doom and like Duke Nukem. Like I think in Doom, like the hand-drawn like sector lighting of that look like stencil shadows, it required a stupid amount of work. But you could, with that, actually make surprisingly plausibly lit looking areas. It's completely manual. So like John was saying with the camera angles there with MGS2, like I'm thinking like I would hate working on that. It's just like, oh, every single time we have to do another scene and we have to take out, and like that'd be a lot of work. I imagine that must have been slightly painful, kind of like making a Doom map with a lot of lighting. I also think in Doom, subtle things, but just like the way the sectors flash color when when a muzzle flash occurs, like they didn't have to do that, and basically very few games at that time did do that, if at all. So it made the game look surprisingly just like lighting was occurring, even though it's not. And I think that was really interesting. And then in Duke Nukem, I've always been a really big fan of like how that game, in spite of being 2.5D, looks more 3D than you would imagine. at times, like when you jump up on like the first level, for example, in Hollywood Holocaust, like you jump up into that area on the building and go in the room, and you're looking down at the street below. I actually think it doesn't break the illusion so bad in there as it does in other 2.5D games or Raycaster games. And also there, I really like the first time you see a building fall down, or like it like compresses the building, but the illusion is there of like a building actually coming down.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Like when the earthquakes occur.
Dude,
So that's the stuff I think about.
What about Doom 64? There's a level halfway through the game that actually creates convincing bridges, right? Where Doom can't do that normally, but they came up with some weird sector trick to give the illusion of the player, if you go into a room, you're going over something, but then if you go back out, you can walk under that same path. You're not actually walking under it, but the way it's built and works makes it look like you're walking under a bridge. And that was like mind-blowing. Like, and that's just, Doom 64 may be Doom 64, but it's still the Doom kind of technology. It has the same limits.
Yeah, it's really cool. Like, I can't even imagine like purposely putting in teleporters in places to try and make things look like 3D objects. What it's like when you go up Doom's second level, you go up the stairs. There's like trickery there too as well, but you're just not really noticing it. I find that
I guess
really
it's the same
impressive.
with that Duke Nukem 3D Hollywood Holocaust when you jump through that air vent at the beginning, right?
Yeah, like
it makes it
you just
feel
jump
like
in
you're
the
on top of a building and you're going down through a tunnel, but it's not actually that.
That's not that. That's really fun. One thing I was wondering about that came to my mind right when this question was posed is I'm thinking of Ocarina of Time and like Link's like shadows like on his feet that change position. I've never really learned how that's done.
I need to look into
and that's
that.
interesting. That's very interesting.
It's like
I don't
two
know.
little like maybe just a texture, a couple little projected things.
They
but
almost
it's not
like
drawing the
stretch, though,
full
a little bit.
right.
Yeah.
They're not drawing a full shadow, right? It's just, but it's convincing. It kind of grounds them in the world. Or even the water trick in that game, where the water always looked really good in that, but it's just two texture layers, sort of like scrolling on top of one another. But because of the low resolution of N64, from a distance, it ends up looking like this super smooth water animation.
Good stuff. Let's move on to the final question. Try and do this one quite quickly. Uncomfortable Username asks, having Spider-Man, God of War, and even Horizon Zero Dawn on the go with the Steam Deck is honestly a huge selling point for me. However, it really has me thinking of the likelihood of another PlayStation Portable. Yes, the Vita didn't have much of a life. Ha ha. But portable gaming in general lost a lot of ground to mobile gaming at the time. In a post-Switch environment where portability can indeed be a selling point, also reaffirmed with the popularity of the Steam Deck, do you think Sony would ever re-enter the portable market with new hardware? Or do you think they are perfectly happy with just the Steam Deck? This is a really tricky one, right? Because in many ways, Steam Deck and even Switch to a certain extent kind of validated PlayStation Vita. In terms of what it actually delivered. I don't think Sony are going to do this, simply because they've got two platforms upcoming already, three if you include PC. They have PlayStation, they have the VR headset. I just don't think there's room. And also maybe there is definitely the concept of having to split your development effort to produce those games for those lower end platforms. The Steam Deck just kind of, either it works or it doesn't really on those titles. But it's kind of, it seems they've left it to the PC space. Any thoughts on this one, John? Because you love the Vita, as we all.
It's a great little system. Yeah, you can actually see some Vita games over there on the shelf. So I agree with you. I don't think that they're going to attempt it again. And I would think that part of the problem is the development resource thing, where this is what Nintendo solved with the Switch, right? Where they unified all their development studios to work on a single platform, because for years they were divided between console and handheld, and that worked up until the point that handheld games became too complex. I would say like the 3DS era, when all of a sudden the development process is now a lot more complicated than it used to be, versus like, say, if you're making a GBA game during the GameCube era, those are two very different things in terms of the scale of development. So the Switch saved them there. With PSVR and the PC stuff and, you know, their main consoles, it feels like they would be stretching themselves too thin, especially that they've shut down so many great internal development studios in the past few years. I mean, that still disappoints me to this day, of course. So I just don't know if they want to give it a shot. And I think he has a point about the mobile gaming situation. Around the time of the Vita's launch, mobile gaming was kind of like eating everyone's lunch, and now it's just kind of found its own area that can coexist with the more traditional game consoles. But Vita did not survive that. So, and Sony itself didn't support the Vita that well. I would argue beyond the first year, they just kind of gave up on it real quick. And even the developers that produced truly exceptional games, like the developers of Wipeout, the studio Liverpool, they made Wipeout 2048 on there, and then for the reward for doing such a great game was, we're going to shut you down. That sucks.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I am looking at Steam Deck though, and do wonder that, you know, if it had a dedicated development environment to the metal, access to the silicon, what could actually be done with it, because you can see that, you know, Switch is punching above its weight simply because of those benefits.
Yeah, when you look at Switch versus the Tegra-based products from NVIDIA, right?
Night and day difference.
Much worse in terms of performance.
So if Steam Deck is doing what it's doing, you know, through all of those abstraction layers, that's really impressive, and you have to wonder what it could do. But, you know, I don't think Sony would release hardware like the Steam Deck that's got relatively short battery life and is massive. But, you know, process shrink, one or two of those, and it's back into contention. But I don't know. The question is really how long Steam Deck is going to last in terms of running sort of proper next-gen games. That's still the big question really there.
Yeah, because we're still in cross-gen period, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, especially if you have something like Metro Exodus, right? If we have more games come along where it's like, oh, it requires ray tracing. Well, the enhanced edition anyway. Can't run that on the deck. So...
Interesting question, though.
Unreal Engine 5, right?
Unreal Engine, that just doesn't do particularly well. It doesn't really function on the Steam Deck, which is a problem.
But hey, you know, Epic said they're working on like CPU related issues and also shader comp issues. So maybe the deck will get better over time. We'll see.
Absolutely.
We'll see.
Okay, well, that's the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content. Ring the bell for those notionally instant notifications. No guarantees on that, as usual. That is my disclaimer. DF Supports Program, new site next week. Tons of bonus material. You'll be able to see it all. I mean, even if you aren't subscribed, at least you'll be able to see what we've done on the unsigned in view, even if you won't be able to watch it. So you'll get a flavour of everything that we can offer there. And of course, there is the supporter Q&A, early access, and all of the rest, and some amazing retro stuff. And hopefully, John, that new episode should be dropping next week for retro supporters.
Next week.
Okay, so much to look at there. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.